Having covered several important aspects of Masonic history and development from the 14th century to the present day, the question is now to be put before us. What was it that was incorporated into and elaborated out of the rituals of Masonry in those early days? For this, we must meet Masonry on its own terms, remembering that it is an organization comprised of twin threads, intricately spun and intertwined, weaving history and legend into one cord, as all truly ancient histories have done. I'm Ike Baker, and this is Arcanum. In consideration of Masonic history and lineage as a whole, and to extract the marrow of meaning from its core, we must also bring symbolic and philosophical considerations to bear upon our examination, and not merely limit ourselves solely to what a trail of paper can demonstrate. For this, we circle back to a definition of Masonry, which we will source from the craft itself. From the North Carolina Masonic ritual, which is in accord, as far as I am aware, with the ritual of many other jurisdictions of regular Masonry, quote, "Freemasonry is a beautiful system of morality, veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols." End quote. Though at the earliest stages of a Mason's career, this sentence is uttered to them at a significant point, many of us are apt to either not fully understand the significance of this definitive Masonic sentence or ignore its import altogether. If Masonry itself claims to be a system of morality veiled in allegory, illustrated by symbols, then we would do well to examine this aspect of its expression through the ritual degrees with a heavy measure of due scrutiny and serious contemplation. However, it is not meant that we should heap or graft any symbolic interpretation of our own fancy upon it, but rather let us continue as we have in examining and interpreting Masonry in the light or context of its own time. For this, the serious student must acquire a formidable yet necessary level of historic and philosophical context. At the outset, several things stand out. Speculative Masonry, which is what modern Freemasonry is in its entirety, having no formal affiliations with trade organizations, is chiefly concerned, at least insofar as its ritual and teachings, the philosophical applications of the ancient builder's art, as allegorical or symbolic of certain truths, perhaps most especially in three respects. 1. In the allegory of Masonry and its tools of trade as symbolic of the process of moral perfection of the individual. 2. In the study and application of geometry as a method of understanding and mathematical proof of the deeper truths inherent to the greater cosmos and humankind. 3. In the metaphysical implications, or capital M mysteries, which are of a distinctly spiritual nature. We see in this threefold successive progression from most immediate control and right application of the personal sphere to an intellectual broadening and understanding by way of the pursuit of natural sciences and the 7 liberal arts. Liberal is here used in its original etymological connotation from the Latin libera, as in to make free. These arts were thought to be a training of the individual to be able to adequately think for themselves, truly, not merely as some societal platitude, pursuing and acquiring the knowledge of the world and processing it by way of a systematic, logical, and critical method. Finally, in attaining the summit of all intellectual and physical knowledge, then passing on to perhaps a different species of knowledge, a knowing that transcends the objective and theoretical or mathematical and enters into the hinterlands of the metaphysical, subjective, and experiential, a knowledge of the metaphysical by direct experience, or perhaps a revelation, which some might compare to the concept of gnosis. First, let us consider a few things concerning Preston and a few other formative figures mentioned earlier, namely the antiquarian Moray Ashmole and the third Grand Master of the Premier Lodge of England, John Theophilus Desaguliers, by way of his association with the Jacobite poet John Byrom. We'll also mention Sir Robert Moray, founder of the Royal Society, whose members figure prominently throughout early British Masonry and esoteric circles of interest at that time. What all these men have in common, besides a membership in early Freemasonry, is a deep connection to and/or familiarity with the variant of Hebrew mysticism, the Cabala, which was popular among intellectuals and esotericists of their day. We also include Hermeticism in this. We covered introductions to Cabala and Hermeticism in two separate two-part series, and I've included links to those in the section below this video. William Preston's early lectures were characterized by emphasis on a strong moral foundation. However, his later works, as pointed out by Colin Dyer, quoting Brother Percy James, from an issue of Ars Quator Coronatorum, the oldest Masonic research journal in the world, tended toward, quote, a series of discussions upon factual matters, which become more and more technical, abstract, and mystical. It is based on a metaphysical notion of King Solomon's Temple, which is looked upon as a sort of Masonic university, with excursions into Platonic theory and Kabbalism. End quote. It is also known that Desaguliers, third Grand Master of the Premier Lodge, was involved in John Byrom's Cabala Club, an exceedingly interesting moment in the development of Freemasonry, as well as the Royal Society. The fact of these members of Freemasonry, the Cabala Club, and the Royal Society, including other members such as Isaac Newton and Thomas Vaughan, to name but a few, moving in intersecting circles and having the same enthusiastic interests in alchemy, Hermeticism, Rosicrucianism, and Cabala, simply cannot be completely discounted. Further, Brother Kirk McNulty writes in his work on Cabala and Freemasonry, quote, the first speculative Masons that we can identify positively are Sir Robert Moray and Elias Ashmole. They were initiated into the order in 1641 and 1646 respectively, both in the north of England. Both were closely involved with the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition. Ashmole was a significant contributor to the literature of that tradition, and Moray was the patron of the alchemist Thomas Vaughan. In the publication Letter from the Grand Mistress of the Female Freemasons, penned anonymously in the 1700s, though later attributed to Jonathan Swift, we read the following, quote, the branch of the Lodge of Solomon's Temple, afterwards called the Lodge of St. John of Jerusalem, is, as I can easily prove, the ancientest and purest now on earth. The famous old Scottish Lodge of Kilwinning, of which all kings of Scotland have been from time to time Grand Masters without interruption down from the days of Fergus, who was carefully instructed in all the arts and sciences, especially in the natural magic and the Kabbalistical philosophy, afterwards called the Rosicrucian, speaking of the Cabala, as Masonry was called in those days. End quote. Now, the imprint of its first publication dates this to 1725, and if this date is an embellishment, we know it to have been in publication at least during Swift's lifetime, which places it no later than 1745. Some scholars have noted it may be a comical response to an original expose of Freemasonic secrets published the previous year. However, it at least reveals a sentiment, however embellished, that Freemasonry was considered among what we now refer to as the Western Esoteric Traditions. This is unequivocally confirmed by the associations, interests, and interpretations of many of the earliest and most prominent Masons. Let us not take for granted the significance of a Kabbalistic interpretation, as the central mythos of the Craft Lodge, and further is the building of King Solomon's Temple, which is a specifically Hebrew history. Finally, we find mention made of early Greek mathematical philosophers, particularly Euclid being an early and key figure in Masonic legendary history via the old charges. He is mentioned unanimously among the three oldest of these. The 16th century Elizabethan mathematician and prototype of the Western magus, John Dee, wrote an extremely influential and widely circulated mathematical preface to Euclid's Elements of Geometry, which doubtless would have been familiar to Masons and intellectual and esoteric circles of the day. There are even some claims as to minutes of London lodges recording lectures and presentations on Dee, alchemy, and other esoteric topics. However, as of this recording, I could not obtain access to these to verify them. Masonry has, from its earliest developments, which we have seen by way of the old charges and their references to biblical figures, Egyptians, Hermes Trismegistus, and the ancient Greek mathematicians and philosophers, to this very day maintained a strong internal tradition as belonging to an ancient chain of transmission of certain moral, physical, and metaphysical knowledge. Let us begin to analyze the symbolic elements of Masonic ritual in accordance with the philosophies of those ancient figures and peoples mentioned in the old charges, and so frequently referenced in the Preston Webb Masonic ritual. The most immediately pertinent is that of the ancient Greek, particularly the Pythagorean and Platonic. To understand the linear trajectory of the Platonic corpus from antiquity to the Renaissance, I refer you to the episodes I've done on Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, which are all linked below. By the 1600s and 1700s, the Platonic tradition was part and parcel of the classical education, not merely just by way of Plato, but also significantly in the works of Aristotle, perhaps his most famous student. While Aristotle developed Platonic thought in his own direction, it is still a significant contribution to the overarching Platonic tradition, which molded the Western world. In fact, the 7 liberal arts of the classical education, which we understand to be of significance in Masonry, come directly from Plato's Republic, where he elaborated the trivium and quadrivium as a course of study which must be undertaken by the perfect regent, which he called the philosopher king. While briefly delineated in the dialogue, this was formalized as a course or curriculum during the Middle Ages by the clerical institutions of the time. This would have undoubtedly been the dominant educational and intellectual paradigm in the 18th century as well, particularly in the realms which Brother William Preston found himself. In his construction of the Masonic ritual lectures, we find explicit imprint of these ideas. Indeed, it was educated Masons such as those early formative founders and many others by which the Platonic philosophical traditions, which are themselves the source of Western esotericism at large, would have entered into Masonic ritual and speculative Masonry. Suffice it to say that Plato understood the significance of communicating by way of symbols. In fact, to Plato, and as he alludes in his dialogue The Timaeus to the Pythagorean philosophers, those ancient geometers and mystic mathematicians, it was the only way to speak of metaphysical truths, which of essence transcend strictly discursive intellectual thought. Each word is a symbol, attempting to express further symbols, and therefore he speaks at some length in several of his dialogues on the necessity of mythic images or symbolic narratives in order to treat of these superessential realities, which by their very nature are incapable of being transmitted in their truest form by words. That said, Plato endeavored in his dialogues to form what is now considered the first Western philosophy of ethics. Yet his ethics were not based on piety, nor exclusively upon social or religious mores. His ethics were an ethics of salvation, of total renovation and enlivening of the individual to their truest potential, and which had massive metaphysical consequences on one's being. We've covered these philosophies in detail in the episode Plato the Magician, which again is linked below. Plato believed that the soul of a person, the part of a human which is deathless, enters into a kind of amnesiac state upon incarnating, and must remember its divine heritage not merely as speculative or theoretical knowledge, but as a remembering. This he called anamnesis, not forgetting, in other words, remembering. Plato, by way of Socrates, considers learning itself to be a form of remembering. This trajectory of education, or remembering of the soul, he called paideia. Underlying this theory is the idea of the immortality of the soul. He states in the Republic that the education of the soul can only be effected by contemplating and coming to know to agathon, the capital G good. In the Allegory of the Cave, Plato delineates his concept of achieving freedom from the bondage of ignorance as becoming aware of the good. His symbolic or mythic image for the good comes in the form of that which gives light. An extremely important word and concept in Masonry, this of course being the sun. Indeed, the trajectory of the Allegory of the Cave is a providential turning away from the shadows, away from darkness and bondage of the lower levels of the cave, and turning toward the light of the sun. We see intimations of this in the ritual format of the several degrees of Masonry, in candidates for initiation being admitted in the west, the place of the setting sun, and being in a state of blind darkness, being hoodwinked, seeking the light. In Plato's conception, the sun was the most fitting emblem of the good, the beneficent, that which is the source of life and order, also symbolic of knowledge itself and of understanding. In Masonic ritual, the lodge is divided into quarters: east, south, west, and north. And this division corresponds to the officers of the lodge. The worshipful master is in the east, the junior warden is in the south, the senior warden is in the west, and there is no officer in the north, because it is the place of darkness. As we see in the northern hemisphere, the sun moves through the southern skies. Its furthest departure north marks the winter solstice. The positions of the officers of the lodge can therefore be considered as the stations of the sun. In fact, they are explicitly so. There are then the junior and senior deacons, acting symbolically as the moon and sun, respectively. This is indicated by their staffs. They guide the candidate in clockwise circumambulations. This is also called sunwise, from east to west by south. In all this, the candidate is being ritually, meaning symbolically, educated in the mysteries and attributes of the sun, the contemplation and imitation of the capital G good. Yet this contemplation of the good would, in Plato's conception, of necessity lead to a behavioral trajectory, a particular lifestyle, a way of being in the world, as thought ultimately influences action. In this, Plato conceived the first Western philosophy of ethics, or virtue. To Plato, virtue is founded on two concepts, arete and eudaimonia, which are excellence and well-being. In order for one to achieve well-being, they must engage in the pursuit of excellence, in Plato's opinion, a moral excellence. We find this exposition again in the Republic. And this pursuit of excellence or virtue is dependent upon knowledge of the capital G good. Plato writes, quote, "Goodness has a salvific effect upon human life," end quote. Also from the Timaeus, we find another symbol of the creative agency of the good in the figure of the demiurgos, meaning craftsman, whom is also referred to and portrayed as a grand architect of the visible cosmos. This corresponds directly to the great architect of the universe, a term frequently used to refer to creative deity, without having to point to a specific name for God among the various religions any individual Mason may practice in their personal faith. The grand architect of the universe is an all-encompassing, yet specifically Masonic, and at the same time Platonic term. Picture of God as an architect is also present in the Hebrew Psalms, whose dating according to most modern scholars is more or less contemporaneous with the writings of Plato. I'd like to turn back to the Allegory of the Cave and recall how it can be viewed as a manual of initiation. In the lower portions of the cave there is darkness, corresponding to the west gate, and a candidate's place of preparation. There is a providential light, this first reception of the sun, which encourages us to seek further. There is an entrance, reception, and trajectory towards the east, moving towards the light, being taught to move towards and as the sun. There is a beholding of the sun, which is the candidate's reception of the light. There is then a return, a coming back to the lower portions to bring light. In Masonry, this may take the form of a candidate being prepared to confer initiation, to bring the light, as well as being a boon to their local communities. Now let us return to a term mentioned earlier, the philosopher king. Where do we find this described, and what does this mean according to Plato? We find in Plato's Republic, Socrates or Plato's answer to the question upon which the entire discourse is founded, what is the best form of government, in the symbolic or mythic image of the philosopher king. We find here exemplified spiritual jurisdiction, self-government, by way of the pursuit of knowledge, one who has dominated the unphilosophical inclinations of their lower nature. In a way, they become an image of that supreme craftsman, in whom and from whom the ordered universe is instructed. Who else do we know to be a philosopher king but King Solomon? I want to discuss one final concept in Platonism, or in the following case, Neoplatonism. This is called the ladder of virtues. In the days of the late Platonic or Neoplatonic philosophers, particularly Porphyry and Iamblichus, this was a trajectory of study and discipline, which led one in an ascent toward the good, the light. We can group this ladder of virtues into three groups: mundane virtues, philosophic virtues, and hieratic. The first group of mundane virtues is comprised of the first three virtues, namely the natural, ethical, and civic virtues. The natural virtues concern things such as physical bodily health, strength and well-being, temperance, stability in one's material life. The ethical virtues are ways of being in the world which are honorable, upright, exhibit a respect for oneself, family, friends, community, and environment. The political or civic virtues concern the relationship to one's larger community. being of beneficial character and influence on the people and institutions around you. Next, we move to the philosophical virtues, these being purificatory, contemplative, and paradigmatic. The purificatory virtues in the Neoplatonic sense serve to separate one from mere bodily association or reorient one towards divine association, not associating too deeply any longer with worldly mundane concerns. This has been referred to as a period of reason in reversion upon the self. This was followed by the contemplative virtue, and largely embodied the intellectual realm of philosophical contemplation. Finally, in this grouping, there is the paradigmatic. And this is a little more abstract. This had to do with the linking of the soul to the paradigm, or the archetype of the demiurge, the master craftsman, embodying the virtues of the Platonic ideals. These were the Platonic virtues until Iamblichus, who added the hieratic or theurgic virtue. These were the rites of ascent or elevation, and served as a seventh virtue, added to the preceding ones. This is when one could truly begin to practice spiritual rites, having mastered the subsequent two groupings. The theurgic or hieratic virtues were the capital M mystery rites, pertaining to the perfection of the immortal soul, moving from the known to the unknown. To the discerning Mason, I believe we find a threefold grade or degree structure in our Platonic ladder here. Yet Plato, Pythagoras, and many others of the Greek philosophical tradition were attested to have received knowledge and training in the arts and sciences in ancient Egypt. Iamblichus writes in his biography of Pythagoras, "He did not fail to visit any place where he thought he might discover something worthwhile. That is how he visited all of the Egyptian priests, acquiring the wisdom each possessed. He thus passed 22 years in the sanctuaries of the temples, studying astronomy and geometry, and being initiated in no casual or superficial manner in all the mysteries of the gods." End quote. It is also attested that Plato studied in Egypt for 13 years under the Horite priest Sechnufis. Plato states in his dialogue The Phaedrus that the Egyptian scribe god Thoth, quote, invented numbers and arithmetic, and most importantly of all, letters, end quote. Indeed, Egypt has a rich history of initiation. In fact, it might be considered the grandmother of initiatic traditions in the West. Among sundry correlations between ancient Egyptian religion and its broader civilization, which its religion completely informed, Egypt had several particular affinities which are of perhaps prime significance to the craft. Indeed, to examine the most basic tenets of Egyptian cosmology and religious tradition is to behold the ancient bones of Western esotericism. Take the city of Thebes. It was for 500 years the capital city of Egypt, and its pharaohs took up residence there. It was also a city divided by the river Nile. The city straddles the river and is comprised of east and west banks. To the ancient Egyptians, whose chief myths were of a distinctly solar nature, the east was the place of the rising sun, the light dawning in darkness. The west was the place of the sun set, where each night Amun-Ra would descend into the underworld on his solar bark, with his retinue of gods and goddesses bringing darkness and blindness to the world, yet only to rise again victoriously each morning, bringing light and life to the earth. The ancient Egyptians had no distinct word for death. They called it traveling to Amenti, the Westlands, or simply westing. Upon taking up power, the pharaoh had three main building projects which began immediately: the construction of the embalming temple, their burial temple, and a contribution to the Amun-Ra temple complex at Karnak. There was no part of the pharaoh's life that allowed them even momentary freedom from the awareness of their mortality. Yet their immortality was something to be secured by various purificatory rites and ritual formulae. The Mesopotamians wrote in cuneiform, the precursors to the ancient Greeks. The Minoans wrote in similar styles, which we academically refer to as linear A, but the Egyptians chose to symbolize everything by certain appropriate images. These were considered to be a sacred language known only to the initiated priestcraft, hence the term hiero, priestly or holy glyphics, pictures. From ancient Egypt, we receive our first conception in the West of initiation, that is, several stages of symbolic drama, wherein a cosmic formula is enacted, and wherein the pharaoh would be the physical representation of the solar god. Yet ritual even played a significant role in the craft guilds of Egypt, in order to erect these monuments, which the pharaohs prized so highly, and which they very correctly were aware would be their testaments for generations to come, as they indeed are today. Skilled workmen were needed to accomplish this, to make the vision a reality. These workmen had their own burial temples near the sites of the pharaohs. They had their own lodges, or per ankh, house of life. These lodges, or guild temples, had their own amenities and religious rites specifically for men of the craft, builders and architects. These men were indispensable, and their trade secrets of mathematics, measure, physics, and sheer ingenuity were prized as chief among the necessities of a civilization in the truest sense of the word. The priest class of ancient Egypt were the sacerdotal elite, intermediaries on behalf of humankind with the gods. They were effectively stratified into different roles or duties, forming a micro-society in themselves. However, they were at the very forefront of nearly all endeavors, which were investigations of nature. The Egyptian word for a god or goddess is Netcher. This may have an etymological root for our word nature. This means that there were classes of priests, such as healing or physician priests, scribe priests, and even priests investigating nature by means of working and smelting minerals and metals, some of the very first metallurgists, truly cunning workers. It is now thought that it is from this tradition that the arts of alchemy and its attendant hermetic philosophy sprung, particularly in the dyeing of metals for religious statuary. Regarding the architectural works of the ancient Egyptians, there are many theories, some more plausible than others, as to how these monolithic monuments and incredibly designed buildings and temples were erected. Take the pyramids, for instance. The stones hewn so perfectly, fit together so seamlessly, almost impossibly so, to the degree that one could hardly slip a sheet of paper between the blocks. Now, some have suggested these structures could only have been constructed at such an early and therefore quote-unquote primitive age by some sort of unforeseen technology or even extraterrestrial help. However, to the discerning mind, something of masonry, both operative and speculative, is communicated by their mere existence. The seemingly impossible feats that human beings can and have indeed accomplished when they work together. No matter how great an architect's skill, he cannot accomplish such feats without others, well-trained, well-ordered, and working in harmony. These two civilizations, the ancient Egyptian and ancient Greek, had a high degree of intersection in the ancient world. However, they would become synthesized by the Alexandrian conquest of Persia, themselves conquerors of Egypt for around 200 years. This synthesis of Greek and Egyptian culture and religion, now referred to as the Hellenistic period, generated the beginnings of modern astrology, alchemy, and magic. Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great, was seedbed of the Neoplatonic and Hermetic philosophies and movements, as well as the early Christian movements, most particularly of interest the Gnostics. These form the basis of the great initiatic mystery traditions of the West. I quote from Brother Jamie Paul Lamb's seminal work, Myth, Magick, and Masonry, quote, "The mystical or numinous quality of Masonic ritual represents the vestigial remnants of the mystery traditions of the Western world, which served as the ancient storehouses of collected wisdom and magic. It seems that perhaps since the end of the 19th century occult revival, the regular Blue Lodge Freemason has not been adequately instructed to perceive the often cryptic occult motifs present in Masonic ritual. This is likely because he has not been mentored from the perspective of the Hermetic arts, nor has he been given the impetus to independently develop the necessary reference points, allowing him to distinguish the hallmarks of ceremonial magic. Similarly, the modern ceremonial magic practitioner often fails to observe that the lion's share of their ritual and grade system is patterned on long-established Masonic ritualism and Rosicrucian inherited fraternal structure, not to mention the fact that the very idea of ceremonial magic, by and large, comes to us in its modern form almost solely due to Masonic scholarship and restoration." End quote. We find particularly apropos to Freemasonry the work of the 4th century Egyptian priest scribe and father of modern alchemical tradition, Zosimos of Panopolis, sundry impactful references and symbols which abound in Freemasonic ritual and imagery. It is from the writings of Zosimos that we find the earliest mention of the philosopher's stone. He refers to it as, quote, "the stone which is not a stone," and elaborates that it is formed of diverse metals and fused under a particular astrological condition. It is no secret that Masonic allegory is concerned with the cultivation of a perfect stone. The Mason himself, with the aid of deity, the divine master craftsman, is both craftsman and material in this work. Zosimos is known for a series of texts which scholars have entitled his Visions, in which he describes in vivid and surreal imagery a series of visions or dreams pertaining to the processes of alchemy. There are certain physical quote-unquote punishments which personages in his dreams undergo, these being symbolic of the various processes of alchemical transmutation, such as punctures at various parts of the physical body, such as the neck, as well as physical immolation. He speaks of a staircase of 15 stairs leading to an altar, as well as significant references in certain of his letters to the acacia plant. Brother P.D. Newman has pursued a highly interesting line of research regarding this and an ancient entheogenic aspect to ancient alchemy and the mystery traditions in regards to Freemasonry. To break here for a moment, I'd like to address, of course, the lingering insinuation of a Templar connection, which seems to be affirmed by the Knights Templar order within the York Rite body. This was popularized by researchers and novelists such as Michael Bagehot, Richard Lee, Clive Prince, and Lynn Picknett, and most famously, Dan Brown. There are well-documented sites of Templar establishment in Scotland, even before the infamous dissolution, trials, execution, and exile of the Knights Templar from France. Scotland was indeed documented as a place to which Templars fled after this persecution, as were the Alps, Portugal, and the then ununified Germanic lands. Certain of Dan Brown's creative liberties in citing Rosslyn Chapel in Rosslyn, Scotland, as a place where Templars and Freemasons are linked cannot likely be true, since Rosslyn Chapel was built long after the Templar dissolution and exile by William Sinclair as a place for his deceased family. Although the Mother Lodge of Kilwinning, founded in the chapter house of the Kilwinning Abbey, was standing at the time of Templar establishment and refuge in Scotland, as it was built in 1144. The most interesting point concerning the Templars is twofold. One, that their history and early legend is intimately tied to the Temple of Solomon, their name in fact being a shortened form of the Poor Knights of Christ in the Temple of Solomon, much like the Masons. And two, the potential of their coming into contact with Hermetic, Neoplatonic, Alchemical, and Magical texts during the Crusades is a distinct historic possibility. And as it is verified by historical record that Crusaders were some of the first Westerners since late antiquity to set hands upon these manuscripts after their migration to the Perso-Arabic Islamic Empire. It is by way of the Crusaders that some of these books slowly leaked back into Europe to be closely guarded in secret collections, even before their translation by Marsilio Ficino. Templar legends abound in Freemasonry. Albert Mackey writes of a Templar origin in his celebrated Encyclopedia of Freemasonry. Albert Pike wrote of the intermingling of the vestiges of the Templars and Rosicrucian adepts over time. Arthur Edward Waite wrote regarding the intersection of Masonry and Templary in later medieval chivalric orders. It has long since been a suspicion, or intuition if not an accepted Masonic tradition throughout the ages, that the Templars and Freemasonry were in some profound way related. Coming to the home stretch of this particular examination of Freemasonry, the next obvious question is, within what nexus did Hermeticism, the Hermetic art of alchemy, Neoplatonism, Cabala, and ritual magic, which we have here specifically referred to as the spiritually regenerative magic of theurgy, as opposed to what figures such as Ashmole and others regard as the vulgar magic of demonic evocation known as Goetia, enter into Masonry? The most likely answer is Rosicrucianism. We will be investigating Rosicrucianism in detail in further episodes on this channel, which will be recommended viewing in tandem with this series on Freemasonry. Therefore, for the sake of time, I'll be summarizing major common points between the Rosicrucians and Freemasonry, as well as certain influential personages within Freemasonry who had themselves a deep interest and were influenced by the Rosicrucian movement. The time period of early modern Masonic development in England and Scotland coincides with two major events. Firstly, the Renaissance, which was a product of the reimportation and translation of the lost Neoplatonic and Hermetic texts by Cosimo de' Medici and his translator Marsilio Ficino, as well as the Christian Kabbalistic exegesis and scholarship undertaken by luminaries such as Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Johannes Reuchlin, and Athanasius Kircher. A significant point is the spread of these to Germany by way of Trithemius, a Christian abbot and known magician of his day who served as teacher to Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and the great Paracelsus. Secondly, the release of the Rosicrucian manifestos, the trilogy of anonymous pamphlets, of which the first two were perhaps the most influential upon the collective consciousness of Europe of their time, published in 1614, 1615, and 1616, which made the claim of there being a secret and invisible fraternity of mystics and scholars in Europe, whose aim was a, quote, universal reformation of mankind. Their admonishment was the preparation of oneself in morality and piety, and that they could not be sought, but when the candidate for admission were ready, the brotherhood would find them. Despite claims abounding in casual scholarship, there is no scholarly consensus as to the authorship of these. Johann Valentin Andrei claimed to have authored the third pamphlet, The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosicrucius, which was markedly different in tone and style, highly abstract and parable-like, perhaps a precursor to the absurdist or surrealist fairy tale works in the vein of Lewis Carroll. Authorship of the antecedent manifestos, the Fama Fraternitatis and Confessio Fraternitatis, remains unverifiable. However, Andrei was connected to a group of scholars in Germany called the Tübingen Circle, which, as in the early formative circles of Masonry, demonstrates a tapestry of exchange and cooperation in literary, spiritual, and intellectual subcultures. The Rosicrucian manifestos ignited the enthusiasm and imagination of the European literati, and men of letters scrambled to find the fraternity and petition them for admission. There is an extant record of Ashmole having written one such petition for admission to the invisible fraternity. The Rosicrucians were the first quote-unquote secret society as we conceive of it today, a diffuse network of anonymous initiates holding some secret and special knowledge with an intention to mold or change the world. Yet theirs was an explicitly benevolent mission. While deeply tied to Protestantism and Enlightenment-era ideals, the Rosicrucians were also mystics, alchemists, magicians, and sort of proto-occultists in an era of burgeoning global interconnectivity. The manifestos are an interesting snapshot of the period, a document concretizing a sentiment of humanism, Christian piety, and scientific investigation of the natural world, all of which was a product of the reintroduction of Hermetic and Platonic literature and philosophy to the West during the Renaissance. It is likely by way of this Rosicrucian influence and its prominence among early Masons, the list of influential early brethren with an explicit interest and or tie to Rosicrucian movement and teachings is massive, that these same elements came to characterize Masonry, particularly in the lectures culled from the investigations of Brother Preston, with the broader and elder Masonic community in Europe in this relatively contemporaneous time. Further attributed Rosicrucian literature assiduously preserved the teachings of alchemy in collections of alchemical diagrams. Much of Rosicrucianism consists of these alchemical and Kabbalistic symbols. Indeed, the early Rosicrucians were preeminently influenced by the works of the Swiss physician and alchemist Paracelsus. Further, in Tobias Churton's groundbreaking work, The Golden Builders, Alchemists, Rosicrucians, and the First Freemasons, Churton recalls an explanation put to him by Dr. Carlos Gilli as follows, quote, "The Rosicrucian movement was undoubtedly a Gnostic movement. However, if any of the authors of the Rosicrucian manifestos had been asked if he considered himself a Gnostic, he'd have answered that he did not. At that time, the image that people had of Gnostics was practically handed to them by the writings of the opposing side, the one-sided writings of the Fathers of the Church, who had fought Gnostics from the first centuries of Christianity. However, within the Rosicrucian manifestos can be found many elements of traditional gnosis, so that the manifestos can be seen as a kind of ring in the chain which goes from Valentinian gnosis, the gnosis of the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, passing through the Cathars, passing through the alchemists of the Middle Ages, the Neoplatonic and Renaissance movement, and above all, passing through Paracelsus." End quote. The Rosicrucian Masonic connection has insinuated itself for centuries. We find in a poem written in 1638 by Henry Adamson, quote, "For what we do presage is not in gross, for we be brethren of the Rosy Cross. We have the Mason word and second sight, things for to come we can foretell aright." End quote. For the time period, the Rosicrucians appeared as the next phase of transmission of the Western Esoteric Traditions, which included Gnosticism. As we mentioned in our episode on Gnosticism, the term gnosis and gnostikoi, Gnostics, antedates Christianity, but grew to even greater prominence during the Hellenistic Christian movement, particularly near Alexandria, Egypt, of the first few centuries CE. As the Rosicrucian furor in Europe began to die down, Freemasonry entered a Rosicrucian period, or as researcher Christopher McIntosh has called it, thus began the, quote, Masonic phase of Rosicrucian history. We see vestiges of this connection in groups formed by Masonic brethren such as the SRIA, Societas Rosicruciana in Anglia. However unique and prestigious for the time, it was itself derived from a rather curious movement in continental European esotericism, in 1750 to be exact, when German alchemist and Freemason Hermann Fichtold created the Orden Golden Rosenkreuz, the Order of the Gold and Rosy Cross. Membership to this order required one be a Master Mason in good standing, and its aims and teachings were specifically alchemical. It is from this order and the subsequent derivative of the SRIA which the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn grade structure entitles was imported. Also, it is from these explicitly Rosicrucian bodies which the Golden Dawn derived its Rosicrucian inner order. It is absolutely impossible to talk about Freemasonry and occultism in any meaningful way without also discussing Rosicrucianism, as this was and continues to be a motive and animating force. The Rosicrucians being an invisible fraternity brings us to the point of secrecy. There have been many valid reasons for secrecy throughout the ages, though Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism is anything but secret nowadays. Their private texts are free PDFs. Their symbols are broadcast on t-shirts and handbags. Freemasons wear rings and use their bumper stickers as a form of signaling or identification to and from other Masons. The square and compasses as a Masonic symbol has undoubtedly entered the mainstream consciousness. It has been said that Freemasonry is not a secret society, but a society which has secrets. These earnestly being the tokens, signs, and words which Masons use to identify one another. If there are any other secrets, they remain so to some Masons themselves. As we have shown, the meaning and purposes of the fraternity and its rituals are a subject of debate perhaps most fervently among Masons. However, secrecy was necessary in an age of oppressive clerical authority. It was also perfectly in line with the secrecy of ritual that had been characteristic since time immemorial of the mystery traditions of the West. Public rituals, such as the Opet ritual in Egypt, served as a socio-political rite, a festival, and a statement of Egyptian religious identity. These were not the capital M mysteries, however. The Temple of Dendera in Egypt, the rites of Eleusis, the rites of Mithras in Rome. These were the mystery traditions and traditions of the initiates, and these were never performed in public or even in front of the uninitiated. There is a certain species of privacy which acts as the instrument of the alchemical alembic, let's say, which must remain hermetically sealed if the operation is to be successful. These are profound mysteries, whose protocols Masonry does indeed attempt to preserve. This also helps to prevent the appropriation, modification, and obfuscation of the central elements of Masonic ritual. So, do you have any thoughts on Freemasonry? Were there any eminent Freemasons or terrifying conspiracies you're upset I left out? Do you think I'm shilling for the globalist elite cabal? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. If you've enjoyed this content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Arcanum Patreon. For the cost of a cup of coffee per month, you can help me continue to produce free, rigorously researched, and practiced material like this. Patreon members also have access to bonus content, including episode addendums and my travel vlogs, as well as other goodies like being able to submit questions for podcast guests. Please continue to watch, like, comment, and share if you're not in the position to contribute financially. There are always plenty of ways to help me keep the Arcanum channel alive and well. Join me again in the next episode where we'll dive deeper into the history, theory, and practice of this and many other related topics. Thanks for watching. In Lux.